What's up, y'all? It's Dev, Mtg. We like it a magic, coming to you from the lab, taking a break from testing Mardu Mishra out. It's supposed to be our first deck tech of the season. Deck is solid, pretty fun to play. I played like 25 games with it. The problem is, haven't actually melded Mishra even once yet, which is pretty irritating. So I figured I'd take a couple of days to get that deck ship shape before I show it to you. But in the meantime, you need content, and I think we got a pretty good little piece of that to give to you today. So let's look at not just the best, but also the coolest decks from the first weekend of tournaments. So strap in, Charlie Chaplin, because I got like 8 decks to show you today, and most of these, save for 1 or 2, are completely brand new. With a bunch of Brothers War cards, I mean, this looked like a powerful set, and it turned out to be because a bunch of people were experimenting on week 1. But this does come with the usual week 1 disclaimers, right? Like, not everybody has the new cards yet, because getting new cards is difficult, and there are going to be some older decks that are still pretty well represented, because everybody knows the play patterns in and out. I mean, again, there's a lot of caveats that come with week 1, but I was surprised with how many new things we saw. So let's go ahead and get to it. Talk about all the decks from week 1 that caught my eye. Starting with the quote-unquote best decks from over the weekend, at least according to the data, right? These are the decks that not only had the best records or finished the highest, but also were the most represented lists across the greatest number of tournaments. Because there were 4 or 5 different events this weekend that were fairly well attended that we could pull data from. So we got a decent sample size for week 1, which is, again, not super common to get. But it also gave us a villain, and it's an old one that you've probably seen before, so we're not going to spend too long on this one, but I got to talk about Grixis because it's definitely the deck that did the best over the weekend. Now, as you may be able to see, Grixis did pretty well over the weekend, especially in this particular tournament, where both decks that met in the finals were Grixis, and one of them ended up going undefeated on the day. Now, these are both very similar lists, but we do have some new cards in here that we don't often see, especially one in particular. If you scan the list real quick, you'll see Blood Tithe Harvester. You'll see Corpse Appraiser. You'll see Shieldred the Apocalypse. These are cards we're used to seeing in Grixis, but you'll also see 3 copies of Surge Engine. Now, these in Grixis decks, Surge Engine ranged from 0 to 3 copies. I mean, you didn't see 4, I don't believe, in any deck over the weekend. And I believe that the outer limits were 3. I think this may be the only list that I remember having seen that played 3 copies of Surge Engine. But this is one of the things that Grixis needed in my mind, right? A strong 2-drop creature that doesn't care what mana you have, at least to get on the table in the first place. And along with all of your other high priority targets, right? If your opponent kills your Shieldred, your second Shieldred, your Reckoner Bankbuster, they deal with your Fable of the Mirror Breaker, whatever, then they haven't dealt with your Surge Engine. And it just becomes a 5-power unblockable thing that they just cannot ignore. So it's yet another unignorable threat. It's one of the few mana sinks besides Bankbuster that the deck really has access to, and it kind of needed that too. So, you know, if you're saving your Infernal Grasp or your Go for the Throat or something, by the way, Go for the Throat doesn't kill this, which might matter with so many people playing that new removal spell. But, you know, if you're saving your Infernal Grasp or Shieldred, you're not using it on Surge Engine, and Surge Engine's going to end up dealing more damage to you in the long run. So, and conversely, if you do use the Grasp on the Surge Engine, that's one you don't have for Shieldred. So I think this card really fills a lot of holes again for the deck, and I'm glad to see some Grixis lists over the weekend trying this thing out. But another, by the way, Hostile Takeover. You don't see that every day. Not a new card. Just one you don't see every day in Grixis lists. But aside from that, the other Grixis list from this tournament, again, relatively similar, but this one plays basically no new cards. Main deck. They left their copy of Liliana of the Veil in there, as you'll see. But aside from that, this one didn't play any new cards. The one that did play new cards in the main deck is the one that went 5-0, which I think is interesting. But there's another Grixis list that I want to look at from the Cool Spot tournament, which we will definitely be talking about a good bit this video. It's a neat tournament, but this Grixis mid-range list, a little bit different from the ones that we've just looked at. This one plays Liliana. It plays Sorin too, which you don't see every day in these Grixis lists, but Blood Tithe Harvester, Corpse Appraiser, Shieldred, again, normal cards. Phyrexian Fleshgorger got added to this one. This Grixis player did not add Surge Engine. Instead, they used these 3 slots on Fleshgorger. I think that's interesting. I want to know if this card survives week 1, because this wasn't the only deck this ended up in. We didn't see too much mono black over the weekend at any of these tournaments, but some of the decks we did see went, 2-1, 3-1, some of the results I have for mono black. And some of the most popular new cards in those decks are obviously Go for the Throat and Gix. People have loved those. But Phyrexian Fleshgorger is well high up on that list too. I think that it gives Mono Black an interesting tool, and it gives Grixis an interesting tool too. You know, against the aggro decks in the format, you kind of shut them out. If you draw it in the late game and you have the ramp, Treasures from Fable of the Mirror Breaker or whatever, you can play it for 7 mana relatively easily in a deck like this. So I really like the addition of Fleshgorger. Not every Grixis mage did it over the weekend, but a couple did, and it seemed like it was a relatively successful include. If you want a nice round little fact about how dominant Grixis was in week 1, it put 10 decks in the top 8 over the 4 events that we looked at for this video. So that is a lot. But again, it's week 1 and people really know Grixis very well. They've been playing this deck for months at this point. It was one of the most dominant decks, if not the best deck. And since rotation, right? So this is a deck people have been playing for a long time, and some new cards might disrupt the play patterns that you know pretty well, but you know your deck better than anybody else that's playing a new deck knows their deck. And I think that goes a long way to help a deck like Grixis in week 1. We also saw Esper. I'm not going to talk too long about this one either. I won't even throw to other dev for this one, but we also saw Esper have a little bit of success in the early days of this format. Over these 4 events, it put 4 decks in the top 8 of events. So that's actually not as dominant as you would expect a deck like Esper to be, which is probably a good sign, but Esper is still out there and it's still an important deck. But I want to talk about new decks above all else because you've already been here for who knows how long. Check the runtime. And we haven't really talked about too many new cards yet. I don't want to do that to you. So let's go ahead and talk about Azorius Control. Now, I never thought I'd say this again, but some of these Azorius control lists from over the weekend do look kind of exciting, right? Both decks that, made it to the finals of the Saturday Standard event were Azorius control decks, and they both went 3-0, which is kind of amazing, leading up to the finals at least. And there's some interesting stuff in here, You've got Teferi that slows the sunset, Wandering Emperor, right? Some stuff that you would expect to see, Reckoner Bankbuster, but look at the new stuff in this deck. You've got Teferi, Temporal Pilgrim, who is probably actually the best new card in the entire deck, but they are doing the Urza Lord Protector and Mightstone and Weakstone, 2 copies of both of these cards so they can have, super late game win condition in case it does come together. But if it doesn't come together, Teferi might win the game for them. I'm also interested in the fact the deck plays 1 copy of the Temporal Anchor. This is probably the spiciest include in just about any deck over the entire weekend. I really didn't expect to see this in Standard, and I don't think you're going to see it in too many blue-white lists moving forward. It's probably just super spicy meme and all that, but it is really exciting to see in a deck that had effectively a perfect record over the weekend, and they played 1 copy of this card. We've also got another Azorius control list, like I said, in this very same top 8 here. It actually that won the whole event. This one plays Denic Pious Apprentice. It kind of looks a little bit like, in some ways, the Esper deck that you see from time to time, but it does have all those control elements. You might have Wandering Emperor and Denic and all that, Reckoner Bankbuster. But Mightstone and Weakstone, Urza Lord Protector, this time just as one-ofs. Again, if it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, that's fine. Teferi, who slows the sunsets, just a one-of. Not even playing the new Teferi, and I think that might be just one of the better cards you could be playing in this deck. Aside from that, though, just your usual host of counter spells and removal spells and such. Not much to see here. It's a control deck, but the cool thing about Azorius Control over the weekend is that there were quite a number of different looking Azorius control lists. Matter of fact, I think the most important one to look at is this one that went 7-1-1 at the most attended tournament of the weekend, which should tell you something. It got 2nd place in that tournament, but the deck that got 1st place also went 7-1-1. So, sounds like they split. That was probably the draw. They split the final. But either way, this interesting build. This one doesn't have all the 1 and 2-ofs of the other builds, and it's got some really interesting includes. This one's got Teferi Temporal Pilgrim, the new Teferi. Again, I think this card is very good for Azorius control decks, and you probably need to play at least a couple of copies of it. They thought the same thing. Silver Scrutiny is in this and the last one that we looked at. Didn't point it out in this one, or in that one. I'll point it out in this one. Interesting little card here, especially for control decks. Because, drawing 3 at instant speed is something you want to do. Drawing 6 at instant speed, also something you want to do in the late game. This one plays Lay Down Arms. It's got a total of 15 planes in the main deck, if you count Rafine's Tower, Spar's Headquarters, and you should, right? So even in a not mono white deck, And even at sorcery speed, this player decided that 3 copies of Lay Down Arms was worth it, and again, they went 7-1-1. This one also plays Soul Partition instead of Fateful Absence. Again, 7-1-1, so you can't argue too much with results. But one of the coolest includes in this entire deck was a card that I was kind of hoping would be like okay in the new format, but I have called a potentially worse Revitalize. The thing is, it's also a potentially amazing Revitalize. It's potentially revitalized against 6, 7, 8 life, and that's Union of the Third Path. I want to know how good this card actually was in this deck. They decided to play 3 copies of it, which seems like kind of a lot for what is going to sometimes be a worse Revitalize. But I imagine if you Silver Scrutiny for X equals 3 or 4, you draw a Union of the Third Path, right? That feels really good. You just end up, gaining 7, 8 life and drawing a card. And that can I can imagine, especially late in the game, when you have the mana to Union and do something else, counter a spell, remove a guy, sweep the board, whatever, that something like this is just absolutely incredible for reestablishing your life, restabilizing your life total. If my opponent swept my board and killed like 4 of my dudes, and I had 1 card left in my hand, and they were at 3 or 4 life, I just got to draw like a haste guy and win the game. And then they cast Union and gain like 6 life on me, that would be demoralizing. I would probably scoop the game to that play. So Union looks like an interesting card. It's cool to see play here, and obviously it works kind of well, synergizes with Teferi, because it puts a loyalty counter on Teferi too. So just neat to see some of these cards in the deck, and this is probably the most interesting version of Azorius Control. And note too that it plays no Urza whatsoever. That wasn't the case for every Azorius Control, but I wonder if it will be going forward. Just like Esper, the good old blue-white control deck put 4 decks in the top 8 of these events over the weekend, and there were only 4 events, so that's 1 per top 8, but that's actually a pretty good average. I mean, that makes for a deck that actually does have a real presence in the meta, but if it matters, and I think it does, 3 of those 4 top 8 finishes came from 1 event. But there was another blue-white deck over the weekend that actually did a fair amount of work, and it's Soldiers. But this deck wasn't always blue-white. There's a couple of blue-white Soldiers. There's a couple of Bant Soldiers that adds green. So Soldiers was not necessarily a homogenous archetype throughout the weekend, but it did end up putting 5 decks in the top 8 and ended up being kind of the most successful aggro deck of the early days of the season. So let's take a look. Let's take a look first at Azorius Tempo. At least that's how it's labeled. This is a Soldiers deck, though. You got your Resolute Reinforcements, 4 Cathar Commando. It's finally time for that card. 4 Valiant Veteran, 4 Guardians. I mean, yeah, these are all just Soldiers. But the deck also plays 4 Recruitment Officer, brand new, 2 Harbin, brand new. Kind of surprised to only see 2 copies of it, right? And then 4 copies. Again, a little surprised to see this, to be quite honest with you, but 4 copies of Protect the Negotiators, which is from Dominaria United. This makes a soldier and also counters spells, so it might actually be one of the best cards in the deck, and it's also one of the only, basically the only non-creature that the deck builder decided to include 4 copies of. So that might tell you something. It's also got 2 copies of Flip the Switch, so really aggro counterspells. Nothing but counterspells that, make dudes. I think is interesting. You got Make Disappear in there too, which technically subtracts dudes if you wanted to, but it's probably good enough a lot of the time. This is the most tempo-y build of this deck that we saw over the weekend, the one that plays the most counterspells and all that. So really interesting thing. You're mostly playing at instant speed with stuff like Resolute Reinforcements, Cathar Commando, but you do have some, sorcery speed stuff. Anthem Effect and Wedding Announcement, Anthem Effect and Valiant Veterans. So really cool little deck right here, but I'm not sure that it's the best build of Soldiers. It's a cool one though. This is another Azorius aggro list, but this one not tempo, whatever. It doesn't play like any counter spells or really removal spells whatsoever, but it does play a bunch of new stuff. You've got Siege Veteran in the deck, the new Luminarch Aspirant. Right, you've got 3 copies of Harbin in this deck, and you got 4 copies of Yoshin Frontliner. I've been playing this in blue-white artifacts, like an artifact aggro deck, and it's actually been like one of the cooler cards in the deck. It's a great little 1-drop. I'm not surprised to see it here, but between this and Recruitment Officer, you've got some nice little soldier 1-drops, and you curve into Siege Veteran, you curve into Harbin or whatever. Like, these are all good, but you've got stuff too, like Valiant Veteran and Thalia, obviously. Note how many creatures the deck plays, and that's because it's a Thalia deck at heart. Brutal Cathar is a removal spell, right? Adeline makes more creatures. Dinnick is a soldier that just brick walls aggro and keeps coming back. So, also, you're not really doing much with your graveyard, so this shuts down a bunch of important strategies right now. So this is a neat one too. There's just a bunch of different soldiers lists, and we're not even done. I got a couple more. Actually, I'll tell you what, let's look at one more, because this one was kind of an archetype all its own, right? The Bant Kayla's Reconstruction. In case you haven't read this card or seen much of this card yet, I have made fun of it, but also I like this card. I've called it Storm the Lestival. It feels like a Storm the Festival that you get less for. Right? It sometimes costs more, and it just gets 3 drops, and it doesn't look super great, but if you have a bunch of strong 3 drops, probably a good card, and obviously white especially, but all 3 of these colors have some really strong 3 drops. This is kind of one of those like hybrid aggro decks that's not trying to be as quick as possible, right? It's just trying to play creatures to the board and win with damage, like an aggro deck. But it ain't really trying to do it by turn 4 or anything. So the deck hopes to go slightly longer in the game than like mono red. And because of that, it can leverage things like Kayla's Construction or Reconstruction really well. So I kind of like this deck a good bit, and I'm interested to build it. Let's take a look next, though, at one more deck in the best category. And it's actually mono white. I feel like this is almost a tradition at this point. Like week 1 of the last like 3 standards, mono white mid-range or control, or whatever you want to call it, has been like a very real deck, but really only in week 1. And then people start to figure it out. Or one lone player, you'll see them every now and again at one event or another ends up 5-0ing with mono white. And you're like, why are you a real deck? The deck is okay. It put 3 different decks in top 8s over the weekend. And that's better than it sometimes does, you know? Sometimes over the first weekend, you'll see like one mono white player go 7-1 and be like, hey, mono white a real deck? And then the whole rest of the season, they'll never see it again, you know? But this time it actually had some real results that I think are really worth paying attention to. Now here, this deck is labeled Mono White Planeswalkers, and we see again a version of this deck every couple of months. Now this one only really plays like 1 new card in the main deck, and it's Lay Down Arms. But this is just about the only card that this deck needed to start taking off. I mean, I would say that there's a couple of other white cards in Bro that I think, in the Brothers, I hate calling it Bro, in the Brothers War, that I think could aid this deck really well, and I'll name some of those in a second. But I think Lay Down Arms is all this deck really needed to start becoming real, right? Just its sorcery speed, but in a mono white deck that plays almost nothing but planes, a Lay Down Arms is going to be, you know, 1-drop, kill whatever you want to, like 9 times out of 10. Aside from that, Wedding Announcement, one of the best cards in Standard. Restoration of Aganjo, one of the best value cards in Standard. And Farewell, the best reset button in Standard. So, you know, again, White has some really strong individual cards, and even though there's not a ton of synergy here, the what little synergy you do get comes together well, you know. You get decent card draw in the form of Bankbuster, Spirited Companion, Sanctuary Warden. White is doing a bunch of stuff that it never really could have done 3 or 4 years ago in terms of grinding and card draw. It never really could do it all by itself, but nowadays it can. Like I said, Mono White got a bunch of really good cards, whether you're in a more controlling kind of mood with Lay Down Arms or something, or if you want to go mid-range and play stuff like Platoon Dispensary or, you know, Tocassia's Welcome or something. Like, White got a lot of good stuff in this new set, and it keeps getting decent stuff, so just keep your eye on the deck. And remember, it exists. It's nice. It hasn't been bad for literally months now, I'm telling you. And it grinds okay, too. I've been playing a little bit of Mono White here and there over the last, again, like 3 seasons. And, like, it always impresses me. So give the deck a shot. But let's move on to the fun category here. These are decks that all had winning records. I want to point that out first and foremost. These are not just, like, memes that went, you know, crap in 2. I went 0-4 and just zipped out of the tournament. No, it's not with these decks. These are decks with winning records, most of which top 16 in different tournaments. The first thing I want to look at is Izzet tokens. We knew this deck was probably going to exist, and whether you call it Izzet tempo or Izzet aggro or Izzet spells or whatever, we know that this deck is going to exist in some form or another, but it actually wasn't very well represented over the weekend. I'm just surprised that it was more or less the only deck like it that I saw over the weekend, save for one Grixis Sacrifice list. Now, Izzet Togs finished 4th in this tournament, not a bad record whatsoever, and it's got a lot of the stuff that you would expect to see, right? But some of the stuff that you might not. I mean, it's got Ledger Shredder, Monastery Swiftspear. It does not have Delver of Secrets, Delver of Secrets. It doesn't have Delver of Secrets, which just surprises the hell out of me, to be honest with you. I would imagine most versions of the deck would have that card, but not this one. You got Third Path Iconoclast, the newest card in the deck, but Phoenix Chick, Balmore. But you got Kumano Faces Kakazan, which, by the way, triggers Third Path Iconoclast and Monastery Swiftspear. I think maybe it's the ability to include cards like this that makes you not want to include Delver of Secrets, right? Because if I include Delver and I get a Kumano Faces Kakazan, off the top of my library, then that's not going to flip over my Delver, right? Whereas it will. It is a card I want in my deck. It's so much value. It does so many things. And it will trigger my Swiftspear and my Iconoclast. So would I rather have Kumano in my deck than Delver of Secrets? And it turns out some players have decided yes. But you've also got Reckless Impulse to quote-unquote draw cards. Interesting way to use this slot, by the way. But it is basically the only thing in Standard that for 2 mana gets 2 cards. There's not a whole lot of ways to do that in Standard. Without having to give up any cards either. And then Alchemist Gambit, yeah, just the one copy of this, but I imagine this will be really annoying some of the time. As far as instants, it's the stuff you expect. Consider, Play with Fire, Lightning Strike, all those 4-ups. Shore Up is just a 2-of. You don't have to worry about protecting your Delver as often, but you do have to protect your Third Path Iconoclast and your Balmore. And then Spell Pierce is in the deck as well, obviously. Not a whole lot of counter spells in this version of the deck, not as many as you often see. But still some protection spells to make sure your Balmore stays on. If you get Balmore and Third Path Iconoclast, that seems like a pretty good little combo, right? Go wide with Iconoclast, cast a couple of spells, give them all +2/+0, and trample or whatever with Balmore and get in. So, cool deck. We expected to see some version of it, and I imagine that there are other builds of the deck. And I want to know how far this one can go. Really interesting little deck here, and I had to include it too, rather than the Grixis Sacrifice deck with Iconoclast, because I was already including another Sacrifice deck in this part of the video. So I want to talk quickly about Jund Sacrifice, because it has one specific trick that I think might be really, really good this coming season. Jund Sacrifice is next, and there is an eye-popping little trick in this deck. Skyfisher Spider, one of my favorite little cards from Brothers War. I really like this thing. What we're actually doing with it in this deck is we're playing, oh my goodness, where are you? Fable of the Mirror Breaker. How did I miss you? Right there. But yeah, we're playing Fable of the Mirror Breaker with Skyfisher Spider, and that is just I don't know how I didn't see that combo. I really don't, man. It's just, if you have a reflection, then copying a Skyfisher every turn seems like incredible. So just for that trick alone, I want to play this deck, but there's a bunch of other cool stuff. This deck plays all 4 Transmogrant's Crown, my #1 card in the Brothers War, for multiple reasons. I mean, not just for Standard. It was also for Pioneer Historic, especially Commander and Cubes and stuff. But I feel like the card is great in Standard, and especially alongside Oni Cold Anvil, it is incredible. If it's your only artifact left, and we've all been in that situation, you can sacrifice it to the Anvil and get your Anvil train rolling again. You can just stick it on like one of the 1/1 tokens from an Oni Cold Anvil, and when it gets sacrificed or dies in combat or whatever, draws you an extra card. That is just unbelievably good for a deck like this. So really like that it's playing Crown. It's also playing Research Desk. That looks good in Oni Cold Anvil as well, obviously. So, this is, if anything, Skyfisher is the only green card in the deck, but it is a really good reason to add green to your black-red Anvil deck. Aside from that, it's got all the hits: Voldaren Epicure, Bloodtithe Harvester, and the other green card in the deck, Teething Wormlet. Now, one thing that I worry about is I think the deck only has 9 untapped green sources on turn 1, and you really want to play this on turn 1 if you can. And I feel like those two things are at odds with each other. The deck probably needs at least 11 or 12 untapped green sources on 1 to reliably play this and get going. But if you can, somehow go Lana War Waste into Teething Wormlet, second turn untapped red source Oni Cold Anvil, you're probably feeling pretty good about yourself. So or just second turn, that's what makes it hard, is that you have to have Pain Land on turn 1 to make this even work. But Wormlet into Bloodtithe Harvester is probably just a really good feeling play. But even if you have to go in this deck Wormlet into Tap Land on turn 2, Voldaren Epicure, grow my Wormlet, that probably still feels pretty good. So good job to Masticore. Props to you for getting the ball rolling on it, because honestly, it's just Spider and Fable the Mirror Breaker. Looks like a good enough reason to build this deck, but there's a lot of other cool stuff going on, like Wormlet, Oni Cold Anvil. So I like all the different angles you're attacking from here. But we got one more deck to look at today, and it's definitely the one that I'm the most interested in playing, and I really want to play this one on stream. I might do it the next time we get on, but what I really want to look at next, and a deck that I'm actually pretty excited about. I've been smiling to myself this whole time, and the reason I'm smiling so much in this video is I'm thinking about this card. Thinking about this deck. Let's take a look at Naya Transformation. Now, this is labeled as like Naya midrange in the deck results and stuff, but this actually, this is not quite Naya midrange. It's not quite Naya Reanimator. It's doing some of those things, but it's doing something way cooler than that. But oh boy, we have made it to Naya midrange, ladies and gentlemen. This is the last deck I want to show you for a reason. Now, you might just be looking at this and thinking, well, this is just Naya, you know, Wandering Emperor, Titan of Industry, Portal Phyrexia. Let me guess, Invoke Justice is in this deck. Yes, Invoke Justice is in this deck. You got that right. You know what else is in this deck? Chaotic Transformation is in this deck. That's really, really neat. Chaotic Transformation reads, exile up to one target artifact, creature, enchantment, planeswalker, and or lands. You can get all of those or some of them if you want to. For each permanent exiled this way, its controller reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a card that shares a card type with it. Put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle, so you get a polymorph. It's a mass polymorph. Now, what if my only artifact is a Portal to Phyrexia, and I sacrifice a treasure, for instance? You know, if I sacrifice a treasure token, then I'm basically guaranteed to get a Portal to Phyrexia. Kind of nice. What if the only creature in my deck is Titan of Industry? What then? So if I sacrifice the token from, you know, Careful Cultivation, or the token from Fable of the Mirror Breaker, or token from Wedding Announcement, whatever. If I sacrifice any token creature in the deck, I'm guaranteed to hit a Titan of Industry with a Chaotic Transformation. That's awesome. I imagine that in a situation where you can ramp into Chaotic Transformation and hit, because you're guaranteed to, you know, sacrifice a treasure and a creature. Just Fable of the Mirror Breaker, you know? Sacrifice a treasure and a 2/2 goblin token or something. And you hit both Titan and Portal at the same time, right? Destroy target artifact or enchantment, you know, put a shield counter or get a 4/4. You have to sacrifice 3 guys, and if you kill my Titan without exiling it, I just get to reanimate it next turn, so it just seems like an unbeatable situation, right? So I love stupid little combo decks like this. And again, I like all the angles of attack here. You know, it's Naya midrange, and it's Reanimator, and it's a stupid, funky, goofy combo deck. So this one excites me. I love decks like this. You know, oh, the only artifact in the deck is the Portal of Phyrexia. Whoops. You know, like that's the kind of stuff that I really, really dig. So I'm going to play this deck like as soon as I possibly can, because it looks like all the fun in the world, and it looks pretty diverse. You know, like it actually has multiple paths to victory. You know, you can invoke Justice your Portal out, or your Titan of Industry, or whatever, win that way, or just win through mid-range playing Magic, grinding, whatever. So it just looks like a really cool deck. And not only is it, to me, the coolest looking deck out of the weekend, but it's also the most successful of the decks in the cool deck category. You know, it went like 3-0 and 2 draws. Maybe there were splits or something, or just you know, both players decided to draw to get a better position in the tournament. These things happen. But it didn't technically lose a game all tournament long. I'm putting this one in the description if you're interested in it. I'm going to put all the cool decks in the description if you're interested in that. But aside from that, I guess I'm done with this one. Just let me know if you enjoy analysis like this, and maybe I'll do it a little bit more often. Maybe we'll do it for week 2 or something. Because I enjoy doing stuff like this. So let me know if you're into it too. Maybe we'll do it a little bit more often. But that's all I got for this one. I'm pretty sure we're stretching relatively long already. So I'm going to get out of here, and I'll catch you cats later with Mardu Mishra. It's going to be our next deck tech. I swear, I'm going to get that guy to meld soon and get that deck tech out. Happy Thanksgiving. I'll probably put it out for Thanksgiving. But anyway, I'm just thinking to myself for a half second there, but I really am going to get out of here this time. Love you guys, and I'll catch you cats later. I'm Doug from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.